The deafening roar of helicopter blades tears through the humid jungle air. A young American soldier is screaming, his face stained with tears and dirt. He is being physically dragged onto the ascending chopper by two of his squad mates. Below him, on the chaotic tarmac, a magnificent German shepherd strains against a thick leather leash. The dog is barking frantically, its paws clawing at the hard earth, desperate to reach the boy it has protected for a year. But the chopper continues to rise, and the dog is left behind in the swirling dust. This is not a scene from a fictional movie. This is the heartbreaking reality of the end of the Vietnam War. It is the story of the greatest betrayal in military history. Over 4,000 military working dogs served in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They were not just pets, they were highly trained soldiers. They walked on the front lines, sniffing out invisible tripwires, hidden bunkers, and deadly ambushes. The Pentagon officially estimates that these incredible animals saved over 10,000 human lives. For the young men drafted into a terrifying, foreign environment, these dogs were their only source of unconditional comfort. They slept together in the mud, shared their meager rations, and formed a bond forged in the fires of combat. A handler and his dog moved as one single breathing entity. The dogs did not understand the politics of the war. They did not care about medals, ideologies, or flags. They only cared about protecting the boy holding the leash. And they did their jobs with absolute, unwavering perfection. But when the order finally came to withdraw, the military bureaucracy made a chilling, calculated decision. The dogs were not viewed as heroes or veterans. They were stripped of their living status and officially reclassified by the Department of Defense. They were reduced to a cold, heartless term: surplus equipment. Like rusted jeeps or empty ammunition crates, they were deemed too expensive to bring home. The boys who loved them were ordered to leave them behind, to die. To truly grasp the magnitude of this betrayal, you must understand what these dogs actually did. The jungles of Vietnam were a psychological nightmare for human soldiers. The enemy was invisible, blending perfectly into the dense foliage and vast underground tunnel networks. The traditional rules of warfare simply did not apply here. Every step could trigger a hidden landmine, and every shadow could conceal a sniper. But the military working dogs possessed a biological superpower that completely leveled the playing field. They had the ability to literally smell the adrenaline and sweat of an enemy hiding in the trees. Scout dogs walked silently at the point of infantry patrols, their ears scanning like radar. When they detected a trap, they didn't bark. They simply stopped, their bodies going completely rigid, silently warning the squad of impending death. Tracker dogs, mostly Labradors, could follow a scent trail through the thickest swamps for miles. Sentry dogs guarded the perimeter of enormous air bases at night, preventing catastrophic surprise attacks under the cover of darkness. They worked in the sweltering, oppressive heat, suffering from exotic diseases and severe exhaustion. Many of them were wounded in action, taking bullets and shrapnel meant for their human handlers. They did it all without complaint, fueled entirely by the simple reward of a gentle pat on the head. They were utterly fearless in the face of roaring gunfire and explosive artillery. When helicopters dropped them into active combat zones, the dogs leaped out first, leading the charge. They dragged injured soldiers out of the line of fire, refusing to abandon their packs. The bond between a handler and his canine was considered sacred. Handlers would willingly give up their own water rations to ensure their dogs stayed hydrated. They wrote letters home, not about the battles, but about the dog that was keeping them sane. For many teenage soldiers, the warm weight of their dog leaning against them was the only reminder that humanity still existed. The handlers had no idea that a bureaucratic death sentence had already been signed. They continued to fight, relying completely on the instincts of their four-legged brothers. They trusted the military establishment to honor the service of these magnificent creatures. They promised these loyal animals that when their tour of duty was over, they would go home together. They promised them soft beds, green lawns, and a peaceful life. It was a promise that the United States government was actively preparing to break. But loyalty, it seems, is a currency that only flows in one direction. As the war drew to a close, the massive logistical withdrawal began. Millions of tons of equipment were being loaded onto transport ships and cargo planes. The dog handlers eagerly awaited the paperwork that would clear their canine partners for the flight back to American soil. They had saved their money to buy the dogs from the military, filling out all the necessary forms. But instead of flight manifests, the commanding officers delivered a devastating, heart-stopping directive. The dogs were absolutely not going home. The Department of Defense had run a cold, calculating cost-benefit analysis. They determined that bringing the animals back would require expensive quarantine procedures to prevent foreign diseases. Furthermore, they falsely claimed that these combat-hardened dogs could never be safely reintegrated into civilian life. It was a convenient, cowardly excuse to save money. The military officially stripped the dogs of their identity as living beings. They were designated as excess military property to be disposed of as cheaply as possible. The young handlers were completely paralyzed with shock and disbelief. They begged, they pleaded, and they offered to pay for the quarantine costs out of their own pockets. Some handlers even threatened to go absent without leave, refusing to board the Freedom Birds without their dogs. But the military chain of command was absolute and entirely devoid of empathy. Officers threatened the young soldiers with court-martials, prison time, and dishonorable discharges if they disobeyed. They were ordered to walk their dogs to the base kennels, lock the chain-link gates, and walk away. Imagine the sheer, suffocating agony of that walk, leading the creature that just saved your life yesterday towards its execution today. The dogs trotted happily beside their handlers, completely unaware of the looming betrayal. They wagged their tails, expecting a treat or a game of fetch. Instead, they were met with the cold snap of a padlock. The handlers were forced to look into those deep, trusting brown eyes and say goodbye forever. It was a psychological trauma that would haunt these men for the rest of their natural lives. They were forced to become complicit in the murder of their best friends. The military had demanded their ultimate loyalty, only to force them into an act of ultimate betrayal. The scenes that unfolded on the departure tarmacs were chaotic and profoundly heartbreaking. Grown men, hardened by brutal jungle warfare, broke down and wept openly in the dirt. They clung to the chain-link fences of the kennels, their fingers desperately reaching through the wire to touch their dogs one last time. Inside the pens, the dogs began to panic. They had never been separated from their handlers for more than a few hours. As the engines of the transport planes roared to life, a chorus of frantic, desperate barking echoed across the bases. The dogs threw themselves against the fences, scratching at the wire until their paws bled. They could not understand why their pack leaders were walking away. Some dogs completely shut down, refusing to eat or drink, staring blankly at the gates with hollow, heartbroken eyes. They simply waited for a master who was never coming back. The human soldiers were physically marched onto the planes by armed military police. As the planes ascended into the sky, the handlers looked out the windows, watching the kennels grow smaller and smaller. The guilt they felt was a heavy, suffocating physical weight on their chests. But the horror of what awaited the dogs was far worse than the separation itself. The United States military had no intention of humanely retiring the surplus equipment. Out of the more than 4,000 dogs left behind, a small fraction were handed over to the South Vietnamese Army. However, without their original handlers, these dogs were completely unmanageable and often ended up starving on the streets. The vast majority of the canine heroes faced a much more direct, clinical execution. The bases were being evacuated quickly, and the surplus needed to be eliminated. The military veterinarians trained to heal these animals were ordered to become their executioners. The sheer volume of killing was a logistical nightmare. It was an industrialized slaughter of the innocent. Healthy, vibrant dogs in the prime of their lives were lined up for lethal injection. There was no mercy, no respect for their service, and no honor in their deaths. They were treated with less dignity than broken rifles or empty oil drums. The government simply wanted to erase the problem and balance the accounting books. They silenced the frantic barking with poison and locked the gates forever. The extermination process was carried out with chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. Dogs that had bravely sniffed out explosives just days prior were dragged from their kennels. They were administered massive overdoses of barbiturates, their bodies collapsing onto the cold concrete floors. When the lethal drugs inevitably ran out, the methods became far more barbaric. Unconfirmed reports and horrific testimonies from the remaining personnel suggest the darkest of ends. Some dogs were simply shot behind the kennels to save time and resources. Others were left entirely locked in their cages as the bases were completely abandoned to the advancing enemy forces. They were left to die a slow, agonizing death from starvation and dehydration under the scorching tropical sun. Their final days were spent pacing in small, filthy enclosures, waiting for a rescue that would never arrive. It is a terrifying image. Thousands of loyal animals slowly withering away, their eyes locked on the horizon. The very creatures that had provided so much comfort and security were rewarded with absolute terror and isolation. It was a betrayal so profound that it defies all human comprehension. The few dogs that survived the initial purge and were handed over to foreign forces suffered equally tragic fates. They were completely misunderstood, mistreated, and viewed as nothing more than aggressive tools. Without the specific English commands and the gentle touch of their American handlers, they were essentially broken machines. Many were eventually euthanized for being uncooperative. By the time the Vietnam War officially concluded, the canine casualty rate was practically 100%. Out of the thousands of dogs deployed, only roughly 200 ever made it back to the United States. And those few were not the heroic scout or tracker dogs. They were mostly high-ranking guard dogs assigned to elite officials. The actual grunts of the canine world, the ones who bled and died in the mud, were entirely discarded. They gave their country everything, and their country gave them a shallow, unmarked grave. The military succeeded in their mission to leave no expensive equipment behind, but they failed utterly in their basic moral obligation to these living, feeling creatures. They threw away the souls of the animals that had carried the weight of the war. It was a tragedy of epic proportions, hidden perfectly from the American public. The silence surrounding their deaths was as deafening as the helicopters that left them behind. The tragedy of the left-behind canines did not end in the jungles of Vietnam. It followed the surviving handlers back home, nesting deeply within their broken minds. For decades, these veterans suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, compounded heavily by the crushing guilt of abandonment. They woke up screaming in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of those desperate barks fading into the distance. They felt like cowards for obeying the orders to leave their best friends behind. The United States government offered no psychological support and absolutely no apology for the trauma they inflicted. The handlers formed quiet support groups, gathering to mourn the dogs that society refused to acknowledge. They fought for decades to have the classification of military dogs changed from equipment to canine members of the armed forces. It took until the year 2000, long after the Vietnam dogs were dust, for legislation to finally pass ensuring no military dog would ever be left behind again. But this modern victory cannot erase the stain of the past. We project our own concepts of honor, duty, and loyalty onto our armed forces. But the story of the Vietnam dogs strips away that glorious illusion. It exposes a cold, apathetic bureaucracy capable of unimaginable cruelty for the sake of a financial spreadsheet. Animals are not tools. They are not disposable assets to be discarded when the mission is over. They are living, breathing creatures capable of profound love and devastating heartbreak. Their sacrifice is a permanent, dark scar on the history of modern warfare. We owe them a debt that can never, ever be repaid. We must speak their names, honor their courage, and never forget their absolute betrayal. Because a society that treats its most loyal guardians as garbage is a society devoid of a soul. The next time you look at a working dog, remember the 4,000 ghosts left behind on the tarmacs of Southeast Asia. They loved their handlers more than they loved their own lives. They saved 10,000 human souls. And their only reward was to watch the planes fly away, leaving them alone in the dark. Their barks have long since faded from the jungle canopy, but the echoes of their heartbreak will resonate through history forever.